Welcome to The Essential Element, the Elements of Education podcast. My name is Christian Page, and I'm your host. We're grateful that you choose to tune in with us. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you're choosing to spend your time here. Today, we had a conversation with my friend Melissa. Melissa has worn a lot of hats in this community and continues to wear a lot of hats in this community. We talk about service tours abroad. We talk about the NextMove internship and the importance of understanding students and their interest in building their strengths while maintaining community relationships that lead to environments where students can thrive. I'm personally a fan of Melissa. Really enjoyed this conversation. So without further ado, here's our talk with our friend Melissa.
Our school, we really believe in relationships, and that is emphasized through mentor group. And so I wholeheartedly believe in that.
What do they need? I have to be able to answer that question. And that takes a little bit of time. The biggest teacher, I think, is failure. The brain works in failure. And those failures are actually synapses rewiring themselves in your brain.
And think about where you want to be. Because when you find your place, you find your people. And our purpose is attached to people.
You know, when there's a phenomenal teacher, when there's a phenomenal educator, when there's a phenomenal mentor, one of the mistakes that we make is we make it look too easy. Like, everyone sees the shining moment on stage. No one sees, right, like the hard time spent. All right, welcome to The Essential Element, the Elements of Education podcast. My name is Christian. I'm your host. And you all know my best friend and partner in crime, Zach. And we have a special guest with us today named Melissa. And Melissa is almost a Jill of all trades, has done a lot within this community, has been here since very close to the beginning, if I'm correct, and has worn a lot of hats in this place. And so we're going to ask you about majority of those hats. But before we do any of that, one of the maxims that we live by here, right? The reason why this is the essential element is relationships. And oftentimes people don't care what you know until they know that you care or know a little bit about you. And so we're curious, Melissa, right? You have a long storied history in Tacoma, a long storied history with this set of people. But how did you find yourself here, right? Like, what's the path that has led you to be Melissa in the Element Schools?
Okay, this is actually kind of funny. So I had been teaching in China, and I had this Australian boyfriend. He was a banjo player. And I'd been living in Australia with him for a little bit, came home for the summer, read this article in the newspaper about this new school that was opening up, SOTA. And I sent him the article and I said, hey, you should come teach at this school. And then he didn't, obviously. And a couple years later, I was back in Tacoma, and I had been like a long-term sub at what was then Jason Lee. And at the end of the year, my position was cut, and there was a teacher here who was going on maternity leave and asking around for somebody to replace her. She talked to two of my friends who both recommended me. And so I came in initially as a long-term sub for maternity leave, and then stayed on. So we did not get Banjo 101. No.
I was going to say that was the death of our bluegrass program.
Yeah.
School of the Arts right there.
But as I know the story, like we got so much more, right?
Yeah.
And no shade to Australian boyfriend who plays the banjo. He's probably an awesome human being somewhere. But curious, right? Like, so you landed here.
So I landed here, and then when the maternity leave ended, that was when John was starting the partnership with Metro Parks. And so they were looking for somebody who could work for both Metro Parks and School of the Arts. And Steve and Sunny Cairns, who were the department heads for humanities at that time, recommended me. So I went to this big meeting with Metro Parks, and they wanted somebody who could run some camps. And I said, oh, I was a camp counselor for like 9 summers. Yeah, I can do that. And so it started out with that. And then I started coordinating classes here, arts classes through Metro Parks at SOTA. Started hiring some of our students to teach some of those. Also, it was a way for me to bring in potential adjunct artists. So get them in through Metro Parks, see how it goes, hire them to teach for SOTA as well. So my position was really, we called it community development. So running the Metro Park stuff, coordinating adjunct artists, and I started this education consortium. That's what we called it, downtown. And so once a month, I'd get together with the museums, the theaters, Metro Parks, several organizations that had educational programs, and we worked to utilize each other's resources. Built those partnerships.
And I know that, right, you're all things awesome. So the story didn't stop there, right? So you had the community impact programming. You brought in adjunct artists.
Yeah, and I wrote grants to support that.
Yeah. Then you have the education consortium. And then there's also now the programs abroad and the NextMove program.
Yeah.
So how did you fit into those things as well?
So I did the community development for about 5 years. And at that same time, I was in grad school getting my master's in teaching. And then, how did that happen? So Steve and Sunny Cairns led a couple trips to China. And I said, hey, can I come on one of those with you guys so that I can learn how to lead a trip? And they said, Melissa, you've traveled so much. You can do one on your own. You don't have to come with us. And then they retired, and then I started leading trips, and not to China though, but I started leading trips and getting more teachers engaged in leading trips. And I've been doing that since 2010, I think, 9 or 10, somewhere around there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And so in every way possible, you've supported students, it sounds like.
Yeah. When I was teaching humanities, so eventually I was a humanities teacher at SOTA, and my favorite was always global studies. And I really believe that students should get outside of the US to see how the rest of the world views Americans. And I'm really pro global citizenship. And so that's really pushed me to lead those trips and take kids abroad. And we have a service component so that students are getting to know people in the places we're going, and they're not just casual tourists, passive engagement, I guess. They really dive in and they make friends. And I have students now. So I've been to Nepal 6 or 7 times. I'm going again in January with students. But I have some who've gone back, about 6 or 7 of them have gone back and volunteered in Nepal. After the big earthquake hit in 2015, 5 of them signed up and went back over and taught in these schools for several months. And some have come back as chaperones on my trips as well.
That's awesome.
One of the coolest things I think about connecting all these pieces of Melissa's experiences to our schools and our students, and kind of the 4 goals of our mentor group, is we want kids to be engaged in their community, utilizing their strengths. And so we talk a lot as mentors, how do we prepare kids to find out what their strengths are in the context of community? You can do that in your own community, like you're in a small mentor group with 25 kids and learning, okay, this is what I'm good at compared to, someone else. But when your horizon broadens beyond the school that you live in, you start to understand your context of how you live in the world, and the place that you fill, the shoes that you fill, and the places that you could fill that you might not even know that you were capable of. And Melissa has such a unique experience seeing that, not only through service and study tours, because I'd love to hear your perspective on maybe even telling a story of how you saw a student grow into who they were as a person by experiencing life in Nepal or experiencing life in a totally different culture. But then also that same context of how do you, as a student, as a young person, 16, 17-year-old kid, go out into the world in a business and start working in an organization that's not school, and start to go, how do I make sense of the world in this new context? And the reason I think that's so important is we have a school system that's so designed around the 4 walls of the school, and we try to contain everything in and then try to recreate what life looks like. We're recreate a job experience. We're going to recreate professional life, when the world outside of us is where life is actually happening. And if you just pull kids out of that experience and go place them in the middle of a safe house for young women that are being sex trafficked in Nepal, or place them into a business in Tacoma working for a graphic designer or an engineer, they start to go, oh, this is the world. Like, how do I develop as a person in that community? And for some reason, we're afraid of that in school. Like, we're afraid of pulling kids out of the school and placing them. But you've had such an experience of getting to see kids become who they are and develop those strengths in the context of authentic community.
Yeah.
So I'd love just to hear your thoughts about how you see that happening with kids.
I have so many stories. Oh my goodness. Okay. So I'll share one. I had a student named Stephanie. This was actually on a trip to Laos and Cambodia. And we were in Cambodia working with this woman, Panhiri Lee. So I picked her guest house to stay in because there was a little blurb in the travel guide that said they support education. I was like, well, we should support them. So we go there. That year, she was nominated to be the CNN Hero of the Year.
Oh, wow.
She didn't win it,
Wow.
but she got a lot of money just from being nominated.
Yeah, of
a lot
course.
of money for her organization. But she was supporting a lot of different schools in the area. And there was one school we visited where she told us a story about this boy wasn't coming to school. So they went to his house to find out what was going on. Turned out he had a sibling at home who needed a wheelchair and couldn't use his arms at all. And so she was like, okay, we'll get him a wheelchair. So we got to meet this kid who has the wheelchair. And he had like a little thing by his feet so he could put a book there, and he could actually like turn the pages with his feet and read books.
Wow.
And Stephanie, one of my students, spent the whole day just working with this kid. And she then decided to go on into physical therapy because of that
Oh,
experience.
is this Stephanie Herod?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
She was my mentee at SOTA.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And then that trip was originally supposed to be to Nepal, but because of political unrest, we had shifted gears and gone to Laos and Cambodia instead. And she really, really wanted to go to Nepal and have that experience. So after she graduated from college, she went and stayed in the safe home and volunteered for a few months. Her dad, who works for World Vision, happened to be in Kathmandu on a business trip, went and visited her at the safe home. He was so impressed by everything that he then joined the board with me. So we served on the board for the Women's Protection Center for a while.
Wow, that's amazing. Could you talk a little bit about the Women's Protection Center? It's based out of Seattle and works with Nepal, and how you got involved with them?
Yeah, so Leela Giesing is the founder of the Women's Protection Center in Nepal. She's Nepali, living in Seattle. And when I was setting up my first trip, I was like, okay, who can I volunteer with? I didn't think that I'd get approval to go all the way out to the village where I lived. Mm-hmm. So I was looking for something closer to Kathmandu. And a friend of a friend introduced me to her. And she was amazing. Her story is that when she was a little girl, she was like the 10th of 11 children or something like that. And she had to go live with her grandmother, and her friends around her started disappearing. And it wasn't until she was older that she found out that a lot of her friends had been trafficked. Mm. And she saw this as a big problem. And she's gone on to she's got like 2 master's degrees in social work, and has always worked to support women and girls in Nepal and here in Seattle. But she started a safe home about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago. And in 2018, we completed building like a permanent location. And then that same year, we were granted another building. So we have 2 safe homes now in Nepal. And there are 3 main goals of that organization. One is education. So girls who come in get an education, like a really good private school education, English medium. And then we provide job training for women. And so we have a whole tailoring program where they go and they're working with alumni of the program. They're learning how to sew and become tailors, and they're learning also how to run a business. And so by the time they're done, they're given a sewing machine, and then they've got other business partners from the course to start their own businesses. Oh. And then the third part of the organization is outreach. And so we've participated with students in the past, going out with the staff from the Safe Home to the nearby villages to give like human trafficking and human rights awareness trainings. So just trying to let people know that, you know, if somebody's coming to tell you that they have a job for your daughter or they're providing your daughter an education, it's probably not legitimate, and learning all about that. So. Yeah, and then when I first started leading the trip, there were a lot of boys who saw it as like a trip just for girls because it was like women's issues. And I kept saying, no, I need more boys. I need you to come and be good role models and show respect for women and talk to other people, talk to men and boys about these issues. And so now I'm about 50-50 male-female on these trips.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
How do you see students impacted by that experience, like coming from Tacoma, traveling all the way across the world to Nepal, and seeing young women who obviously have such a completely opposite experience of what life is like from being trafficked and then rescued, getting kids interacting with those people, with that group of people? Like, how do you see that impacting who they are as mentees?
So let's see, how do I answer that?
Even just stories of like
Well,
individuals.
I do think it builds their empathy. And then when I taught global issues, I always did a unit on human trafficking and in lots of areas, not just sex trafficking. But I think that students see that it's easier for them to see it first in other places. Easier than seeing it here. But once they've seen it there, then they start to notice the problems that are happening here. I think it's just hard to admit that trafficking happens everywhere. So they start to recognize that more. Oh gosh. What else do I want to say about that?
Can you think of, some of those kids that went to Nepal on the first trip with you, then went back on their own after the earthquake and spent, some of them spent like 3 months on their own living in Nepal, right?
Yeah,
working
or
there?
more. Yeah. They did that and they all want to go back.
Yeah.
And some have gone back multiple times. This year I'm taking 2 alumni as chaperones on my trips. One has actually chaperoned 2 trips with me before, and he was on my first trip to Nepal. And he got very sick on that first trip, but he still wanted to go back. He also went back after the earthquake. When he was in college, he did a whole presentation on trafficking and got to go and speak at a national conference for his college. My other alumni just graduated from college, and she's interested in social issues, I guess. I can't remember the exact name of her major. But she's traveled a lot as well.
Yeah, so obviously, it's a life-changing experience. Like, you can read about global issues in a humanities class, and there's a certain amount of impact that has in your life, whether you're moved by it or the stories have some meaning to you. But it's such a different experience to travel across the world and actually be in community with someone and learn about their story. That obviously changes the way you perceive the world. These kids that you're talking about, you took on this trip, they on their own came back a year later, was it like a year later, and spent 3 months living in Nepal completely on their own because they were so moved by that experience in high school.
Yeah.
That's just, it's an example of how, like, living in the context and learning in the context of community is life-changing. It does change the course of how you see the world beyond just reading about it. Not to say it's not important to read about those things, but education has to expand beyond just storytelling and learning about something and learning in the context of real community. And I mean, I think that's a good transition to talk about your work with the Next Move. As we think about, like, one of the biggest goals we have is that every single junior we place into an internship. And you think, oh, internships, that's great, so that you can get kids a job, or they can like learn some life skills, or what we call like 21st century skills. But beyond that, you learn more about who you are as a person and how you engage in community when you're stepping outside of the school and actually doing it in the context of working in a real business.
Yeah. I was really excited when John asked me if I would go back to school and get my career in tech ed cert to do the Next Move internship. I was pretty excited about that. I did a little bit when we were teaching online, and I thought, yeah, I'd like to get back to my community roots. And so it has been really fun seeing these kids. They come in beginning of junior year and they're still pretty shy. They don't talk to each other that much. They don't talk to anybody that much. And then to see them practice, like everything we do in first semester, they're doing at school with people they know. And I keep emphasizing, you're practicing so that you can do this in the community next semester. So sending a professional email, sitting through an interview, answering questions, making eye contact, shaking hands, all the things that we're doing and practicing right now will help them next semester. And then I've had a couple years now where I've been able to see that. I go out in the community and they are smiling when they're out there, and they can tell me everything that they've been working on. And they come back so much more confident and friendly, and more aware of themselves. Like in every context, really, aware of themselves and aware of how people see them. It's a chore to get them to get off of their phones in class even. And so once they do that, they become really happy.
Yeah, and doing that in a different context, right? Like if you're sitting in a classroom with 25 other kids, what's your access to the world? Just the device sitting in your hand.
Yeah.
That's the access point.
Yeah.
Because all I see are four walls around me, the kids that are all exactly the same, not exactly the same as me, but the same age range, the same expectations.
Yeah.
You suddenly shift that context, and now you're placed into a business where you're working alongside professionals, and they're adults going like, hey, this high school kid's here. What am I going to do with this kid? Like, it's a very different environment to learn how to practice those skills than just sitting in a classroom.
Yeah.
How do you prepare kids for that? So obviously I don't think people probably understand how much work goes into getting to know a student and saying, I know you as a person, what your skills are, where is a placement that you're going to thrive in and learn from. And there's always going to be mistakes. So how do you go about that process of sitting down and deciding where a kid should be placed?
Okay. I probably do a lot more than other people in this respect. I have a massive database that I keep on my students. So anytime they're talking about an interest that they have, or like there's an assignment and they've identified a couple of careers they might consider, I just type that in there.
Wow.
So that in November or December, when we sit down and we're looking at everything that's available and looking at their interests, I can say, okay, I've seen you identify this type of work 3 or 4 times. And then you've got these other outliers. Where are your interests right now? And because at that point, they will have done some career research work and looked at how to get into that career. Like, what's your pathway? Is it training? Is it college? Is it an apprenticeship? Something else? How much is it going to cost you? So they can really think about what they want to do. And sometimes they're like, okay, well, this thing I've said 3 times, like, I know I can do that. That's what my dad does. But I want to give this other thing a try.
Yeah.
And so then we'll look for something along those lines. I also had a student, when I went to visit him, he was working in a school, and he was talking to me and the teacher he was working with about what he wants to do. And he said he wants to be an architect. And she turned to him and she said, well, what are you doing here in a school then? And he said, well, I really need to work on my presentation skills and public speaking.
Yeah.
And I was hoping I could get that here. And so then I suggested that maybe she let him teach a lesson at some point. And so then just by bringing that up in conversation, he was able to have those experiences with her and gain that confidence.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great intro too, because like at cursory level, you would think, okay, you're pairing kids in internships. What are you interested in? I'm going to keep a database of here's your interests, here's your skills. Oh, graphic designer. Oh, like paralegal. Oh, you're going to do rounds with a doctor in the hospital. But it goes deeper than that to know the context of each business and how they operate and whether the skills and level of professionalism that kid has will match in that context. Like that's a level deeper of understanding of both the business that you're placing them in and the student.
Yeah. So I kind of think of first semester as formative. So they're practicing all these things with me, writing drafts of their resume. They go out a couple days a week and they're working in a classroom with a teacher. So they're having an internship practicum right now. And then over the next month or so, we'll have a badge that they have to earn. And that will entail updating their resume to include their current experience and an objective for what they want for next semester, getting their cover letter written, and completing a couple IRCs, industry recognized certifications, a couple of things like that. And so then it's everything counts now. I know I've been a little lenient with deadlines here and there, but now this is for real. If you don't have your stuff in by this date, you're not considered in the first round. So in the first round of, these are the kids that applied for these internships, who's ready. If they aren't done with their stuff, they're not ready.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm such a fan right now. No, and I don't mean that in any kind of facetious way. There are people who end up embodying pillars of the work that they do. And I think you fit the bill, right? And I'm not saying this to patronize you by any means, but one of the things that I often try to convince people in schools to do, right, is that piece around ethnography, paying attention to students and understanding the context of the world that they live in, the area that surrounds us, and then what do I know about my students?
Yeah.
And one of the things that becomes really difficult is people will ask the question how do I build relationship with how would you build a relationship with anyone else, right?
Ask questions.
Yeah, right. And now I know these things about them.
Yeah.
And I love that approach that you're balancing relationship with rigor.
Yeah.
You're balancing timelines. I'm trying not to fanboy over here, but I think that that's so special, right? To be able to have all of those and not even thinking about them as data points, but actually being interested in the people that you're teaching.
Yeah.
I think is really special. And I think about the other side of this is you understand the interests of your students. You understand their strengths. You're calling the best out of them. But in order for you to do the work that you're doing, you also have to maintain some really important community relationships, right? Those placement areas don't just appear out of thin air. Those trips abroad just don't appear out of thin air, right? So hearing this thing about building on student strengths and taking high school juniors to a place and creating an environment that works for them. But how do you go about maintaining those community relationships so that students have the container, the environment necessary to have these experiences?
I just want to jump in real quick because I want to just brag on Mo here a little bit and talk about that is one of the biggest strengths that she has in our school community is being able to connect kids and having these strong ties, not just in Pierce County, but around the frickin' world. She has connections to say, hey, you're a young person, you're coming into the school. Let me share with you some of these resources that I've spent decades building in the community, and I'll help connect you into the world. That's you're being an ambassador for kids into the global experience, which is pretty phenomenal. I think it's pretty amazing.
Oh, that actually reminds me of something that happened a couple of weeks ago. I learned that a student wants to get into building prosthetics.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, what interested you in that? And we had this little conversation, and I said, I got to tell you about this museum that I visited in Laos.
Oh, wow.
because there are a lot of people that there was a lot of unexploded ordnance, or there is in Lao, and people are still like finding it when they're clearing land for farming, and a lot of people are missing limbs from things exploding then. And so there was this whole museum about the Vietnam War, and then you could go in and see all the things that they've done with prosthetics and like test things out and stuff. So I told him about that and got him on the website.
That's
to
incredible.
Check it out.
Yeah.
So he's learning more of that history.
Yeah. But I mean, you were talking about the idea of an ethnography.
Yeah.
Like you were doing it in two directions, right? You're like studying your students and who they are as people and keeping a database of them, their street data, if you will.
Yes.
And then at the same time, you're also like a student of the world and knowing, like you're studying the world as a global citizen and a traveler, and then you're connecting those two and finding connections points.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just incredible. I think it's really cool.
I think one of my favorite parts about this is that you're not saying any of these things braggadociously.
Right.
Like there's a level of humility, or just like, that's who I am. So like, don't be surprised. And I think that like, I'm just becoming a fan as things are unfolding. Can I ask you really practically, right? Because one of the through lines that I'm hearing in this discussion is you talked earlier about the trip abroad and like sharpening of a lens, right? If I can see it there, I can see it anywhere. I'm also hearing the same through line in the placement for folks. Like if I have an interest, I can build upon that interest, right? I'm a bright-eyed 11th grader.
Yeah.
Hoping to develop some intangibles that help me in the real world. How do you find yourself cultivating an environment that takes bright-eyed into like confident in my abilities? I know it's a really nebulous question, right? But like, how do you know what to do with someone once they're in your care? Or like, what are some of the markers that you know, like this is the right track or things are working? Is that all, is it all art? Is it some science? Is it?
Oh gosh. I don't know. How do I know it's working? I don't know. I talk with every kid every day and find out where they are with things. Are you talking about like, how do I know it's working when they're in their placements in second semester, or how do I know to get them there?
Yeah, you had named that the first semester is formative, right? Now we're seeing like, is what you learned in this formative space working? Like, what are some of the things that you look for as markers to say like, yeah. You know, I'll give you an example. I'll tell a story.
Okay.
Right. Like, so we're raising my kids at home.
Yeah.
And, you know, my daughter goes off to pre-K. And we're in a position of like, you know, she's grown up mostly during COVID.
Yeah.
And so we tried to teach her like a lot of things. And like sometimes the playground is a marker of like, are you learning how to share? Are you learning how to be kind to people? Right? Are you learning how to defend yourself, even if something, or how do you say no to something? And then we send her off into pre-K, and like what we did over the last 3.5 years, like, is that working? You know what I mean? And I'm curious of like in a placement or in a broad program where, you know, they're supporting folks with different abilities. Like how do you know if it's working or not?
Oh gosh. I mean, so far, I think everything has worked. There was one student last year. I don't know if I should talk about this. There was one student last year who was struggling at his post, and we were also hearing from his supervisor who was struggling with him. And I went in and met with them, and I was prepared to pull the kid from his post, but he wanted to stay. And his supervisor wanted him to stay. And so it was like, okay, I don't know what we just did here, but they both want to try to make this work. And so I think it did end okay in the end. I don't think that student is going to go into that field, but
sometimes those pieces of growth are almost more important than a success.
Yeah.
Like going in, failing, or not necessarily failing, but struggling, and being like, I am really wrestling with how to like engage with this work and be like who I am in this context. I have to step up and learn how to be more professional. I mean, I was going to bring up another student from Sammy that was doing an internship that was mostly online, given really specific tasks, and we had to step in and multiple times pull this kid aside and say, like, what's going on? This is a really typically high performing student that gets like all A's and B's. They're usually really responsive, and the internship host is saying, like, they kind of gone AWOL. Like, we'll have meetings, they'll show up and they'll turn their camera off and won't really engage, and we're like, what is going on? And so we had to have multiple meetings, and it turns out that what the kid was really struggling with was, one, he was overwhelmed by what was being asked of him, and he didn't know how to say, like, I don't know how to do that. He was embarrassed. And secondly, like, he had a health issue that, like, you know, led him further and further behind. And I was just shocked at how empathetic a lot of these businesses are. They were going, well, why didn't you just say something?
Yeah,
we want to
really
help.
are.
And like most people in the professional world want to help kids. They need someone like you or like Alexa, Sammy, or someone to step in and say, I need help learning how to do that because I don't work with teenagers.
Yeah.
So we need to play the mediator. But most adults want to engage in kids' lives and help them grow. They don't. They expect that. They expect it to be bumpy sometimes.
And we do visit. So I go and visit all the kids at their sites, and then every month the student is sending a reflection email to me and it's to their supervisor, copying me, and I give them prompts to write about. So I am learning about what's going on there, and then they have to also copy me on all communication that goes between them and their supervisor. And there was an instance last year, kind of same thing, where the supervisor was requiring, like, I don't know, 15 hours of work over the weekend or something. And I had to help this student. He's like, it's okay. And I was like, well, no, this is the time that you have for your internship. Let's stick to this time. And so we reeled her back in.
This is not free labor for you, just so you know, like for the business.
And then what I get more than anything is the supervisor will ask, you know, is there something more that I should be doing? And usually by then I've heard from the student that there's something they want to try that maybe they're not trying yet. And so I can bring those things up in conversation, like, oh, have you had a chance to design this thing? And then the supervisor will say, oh, no, we hadn't thought of that, you know, and then they'll let them do it. So I can usually help the student push that. I can advocate for the students to get the experiences they want.
That's incredible.
Listen, I'm signing up for the fan club. If there's not already a page, I'll be the one to create it. But I think I want to ask you one final question as we're walking out of here, right? Because you've been doing this kind of work for a number of years, right? And I know that there are some times where one year is harder than another. But I guess the question that I want to ask you is, like, what has you continuing to show up come August, September? Like, what is so special about the work that you're doing, right? That you're continuing to wear all of these different hats, build these community relationships, lean into these student stories. Like, what is the most rewarding aspect of doing this work?
I'll tell you what I told John. I just want to run cool programs for kids. And there were a couple times where I thought I was going to, go through a principal program, and then I didn't. And I reflect on that now, and I think, you know what? I don't enjoy supervising adults at all, really. I don't want to do that. I just want to run cool stuff for kids. Yeah. So I get to do that with the NextMove internship and with the service and study tours. And camp. I run Camp for IDEA. Yeah.
Melissa, thank you for continuing to run cool programs here, for all the impact that you've had on students and adults' lives in the area that we get the opportunity to live in. And thank you for taking some time to hang out with us today and to tell some of that story. So hopefully we have you back again soon, but really enjoyed having a conversation with you today.
All right. Thank you. Yeah.
Elements of Education is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in Tacoma, Washington, dedicated to changing public education to better serve the specific and diverse needs of students in our public schools. For more information about how you can support the work that we do, please visit elementsofed.org, or you can find us on Instagram at Elements of Education or on our website.